Just starting the stream to see that the streaming has no issues. It's a very cold night in Melbourne, the first cold night we've had, and it's a sad occasion because a close friend of this station and of many amateurs in USA, Gordon Smith K7HFV, passed away this week. He was very much took me under his wing when I toured America in 2008 and spent several weeks in Salt Lake City, where he resided. And he was the editor of the Utah Amateur Radio Club's magazine called The Micro Vault. They do all sorts of extraordinary work over there. It seems that the remoteness of a locale, and Salt Lake City certainly is a relatively remote city in the deserts of western USA. The more remote you are, the more important amateur radio becomes, and the Utah Amateur Radio Club is a particularly cohesive one in no mean terms due to Gordon Smith. I'm going to take a risk with this transmission because in this country, in Australia, music played for test purposes is no longer illegal, and Gordon was an accomplished church organist, and I'll play a little bit of that in the course of this podcast. Anyway, it's 9:30 and I'm due to go on the air. I see that we have streaming, which is good. So on with the motley. Hello, this is VK3 Alpha Mike Lima from Burwood East, 20 kilometres east of Melbourne City, starting the regular Saturday night test transmission. Those of you listening on radio on 147.475 will notice the rumbling and hissing of fans in the background. I've got heaters running in this shack because the temperature outside is down to about 10 degrees, and we Melbourneites, unlike people from the United States who have snow in winter, are not used to the low temperatures. So hopefully that won't be too much of an impediment to tonight's transmission. On the list for transmission tonight are a number of documentary films on the early history of television, its technical development, its programming development, and its financial history, quite apart from the infrastructure that was needed to launch it in every possible way. And the earliest of these films that I have for presentation tonight dates from 1935. In fact, depending on one's definition of a public television service, the Germans, the Nazis, were first in March 1935, more than 18 months before the Brits, in the launching of a television service, which we'll see, I hope, as long as I don't run into copyright problems with films. You can never tell from one week to another what sort of copyright restrictions we might run into. So I put them up and I hope for the best, and if I have to withdraw them, well, it's better to seek forgiveness than permission, particularly with material that's 86 years old or more. You don't even know who to approach for permission. Anyway, this is a sad occasion. Those of you who've been listening to the IRLP links I used to have with Utah, with Salt Lake City years ago, regarding the mutual publications we did on modulated light communication in scientific magazines and at scientific conferences like Photonics West 2008 in Silicon Valley, will know that I had fairly continuous contact via IRLP with two stations in particular in Utah. One was Clint Turner, KA7OEI, who hosts my web pages now to do with modulated light on his site, which is called modulatedlight.org. That's modulatedlight, one word, .org. Well worth a look, I think. And the other station, who took me under his wing for visits to Utah in 2008, was Gordon Smith K7HFV, an immensely talented man. He was the editor of the Microvolt, which is the Utah Amateur Radio Club's newsletter, magazine, online as well as printed. And he mentored God knows how many hams, got them through the exams, encouraged ham radio in every possible way. He was a modest, quiet, jovial, welcoming person. And before I got to Utah, he had actually made up a CD-ROM for me with a lot of text that he'd written and photographs that he'd taken of various places of interest around Salt Lake City, which in due course, many of them, he actually drove me to in his own car, a little red four-wheel drive, which you'll see. So rather in a haste, I have made up a quarter-hour obit of Gordon Smith K7HFV, derived from my own photographs and video shot in 2008. Unfortunately, in those days I only had a standard def camera, 480p I think, and not a terribly good one, but by upscaling suitably and using the right software, I've been able to optimize the audio and video quality of these. So let's go back 14 years to 2008, and I'll do you a quick introduction to Gordon Smith K7HFV, who died this week very sadly after a long battle with cancer. This is Gordon on the right, Clint on the left, as I first met them in Salt Lake City in 2008. Gordon had been a broadcast engineer for many years. This is him on the left there at the meet and greet they held for me in Salt Lake City.
Okay, Prue, you're about to see what it's like to drive in a snowstorm. And I'm trying to get an unobscured part of the window. It's a bit difficult.
The weather in Salt Lake City was frequently one that we never encountered.
From the last 2 days. The windscreen wipers are having a bit of difficulty in getting the snow off, and we had lots of wind before, but now it's got less wind. It's actually reasonably comfortable in temperature. Maybe it's just that I'm rugged up well. But
this is driving with Gordon Smith through the streets of Salt Lake City in January.
Don't worry, Prue, I'll keep you informed, and there'll be enough video for you to see what we're going through.
A video for my wife. Gordon actually took me to KSL, one of the broadcast stations in Salt Lake City. We met the chief engineer there, who you can see there on the right. That's Gordon on the left. And Gordon and I also did a plane flight with Mike Mladajovsky, here seen, professor of mechanical engineering at the University of Utah for many years. And the two of them flew me over the top of the place where the Golden Spike was jammed into the ground for the meeting of the Transcontinental Railway's western and eastern sections in 1869. This is Gordon on the left and Brett, two of the local amateurs in Salt Lake City, who showed me around. Their equivalent of Como House is a house called the McCune Mansion, and they were kind enough to take me to see it, knowing that I was interested in history. So here's a little of the McCune Mansion.
This is Gordon and Brett, our light beam friends, and Brett's taken us for a look at this rather extraordinary Edwardian, or Taftian, I suppose they'd call it here, mansion. What was it, Taft or Roosevelt Teddy? I suppose Teddy Roosevelt. It's been pointed out that there are two female figures above that entrance, one of whom has lost her breasts. only in America. Anyway, this is the centre of Salt Lake City. It reminds me of the Palace of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles, Hall of Mirrors I should say. And here are Brett and Gordon looking suitably dumbfounded, even more so than the day when we had the light beam communication.
Now, Gordon was the organist at this church. It's Mount Tabor. It's actually a Lutheran church in Salt Lake City, which, in view of the Mormon origins of Salt Lake City, actually qualifies Gordon for the title in Salt Lake City anyway of being in the diaspora, a Gentile, as it were. But Gordon had to call in here to pick up a few things for the following Sunday service. And while there, just impromptu, he showed me the church organ, which and this developed into a little recital.
That's the entry that we came out of. And this is Mount Tabor, the Lutheran church at which Gordon is organist. This is the church in the round at which Gordon plays the organ. And down here, with its pipes on show, is said organ, pipe organ, 2 ranks, and a number of foot pedals down here.
Now, if you want to see the video that goes with this audio and you're listening on 147.475, please Google the phrase VK3AML 23 April 2022. That's, again, Google the phrase VK3AML 23 April 2022, and we're live streaming the video along with the audio. Back to the video of Gordon Smith K7HFV, the late Gordon Smith, as of this week, sadly, and the hidden talents of an amateur radio operator.
Which must take quite a bit of skill to play. The various stops. Seems to have quite a few stops, and a mirror to view presumably the pastor's position while the organ is being played. So there is Gordon Smith's organ, on which he spends Sunday mornings I should say. Turning around, the design of the church is such that the central spire is an area in which light is let in, up there. There's the baptismal font on the right. It's quite a cosy little church in the round. And there's Gordon coming back. How many ranks of pipes is it, Gordon?
Just 2.
Yeah.
It's a hybrid organ, and the rest of the sounds are electronic.
Oh, okay. So those are speakers down the bottom left and right. Are the pipes normally exposed like that?
Yes, there are a lot of organs that are built out in the open.
Right. What is the purpose of the felt ring at the top of each of the pipes?
These are closed pipes, and so in order to tune it, you need to be able to move the cap up and down.
Oh, yeah.
And the color is felt that seals between the 2 pieces of metal.
Ah,
That's
okay.
an airtight seal.
Yeah. And you've got all of those stops operative, or?
Yes, they all do something.
Mm.
When a stop says 8 foot,
Yeah.
that means it plays at the same pitch that a piano would.
Yeah.
One that's 4 foot, that means the longest pipe for the low C would be 4 feet long, plays an octave higher.
Okay.
And 2 foot adds another octave on that.
Right. Okay.
We have some other things that, like the 1 and the 3rd, that actually play a whole different note.
Yeah. Right.
Actually adds a harmonic.
Yeah. Okay.
And,
do the different pipes give different tonal values, or?
yes, we have 2 ranks here. This one is what's called a principal.
Mm.
The other one is a flute, it's a little quieter stop.
Okay.
They both appear at both the 8th and 4 foot levels. Build up the normal freight chorus by starting with the 4 foot and then adding to it.
Okay.
The upper 2 harmonic additions are electronic. The little dot here means that that's a fake sound instead of a real one.
Right. And this on the left is just a duplicate set, or?
Now this set of stops is for the lower manual, which is called the great organ.
Yeah.
This set over here is for the upper manual, which is called the swell organ.
Yeah.
And this set is for the pedal organ.
Okay. So the pedal, they can all hit the same notes, can they? Or?
Yes, they can all hit the same notes. They don't have exactly the same palette of tones. The great family starts with the 4 foot sound, or with the 8 foot sound. So
yeah.
It's maybe more of a masculine sound. The swell organ starts with the first principle at the 4 foot level. So it's a little higher sound.
Right.
And the pedal, as you might imagine, starts at a lower pitch. It starts with a 16 foot sound down here.
Yeah.
And we can also add some other things to that.
Must take a lot of coordination to do the pedals and the 2 keyboards at the same time. Although that rarely would occur, wouldn't it?
That happens all the time.
Oh, okay.
At this point, I was absolutely reeling in shock. You have to remember, this is Gordon K7HFV. He only does this as a hobby. His profession was broadcast engineering. So at this point, having given me this impromptu display, which he later told me he wasn't up to his usual standard because he hadn't worn the footwear that was ideally necessary for playing the bass pedals. It was a pretty impressive display. Gordon Smith K7HFV. I'll just continue with this.
Well done. I would have clapped if I could have dropped the camera.
One thing I forgot to do is get the electronics tuned so they match the pipes.
Okay.
The pipes change pitch with temperature and the speed of sound, whereas the electronic part tends to stay put, but we have a way to work it.
Oh, that's rather alarming.
I can put an electronic sound with a pipe sound.
Get the beat note. Okay.
Match up.
Yeah. Okay.
And then it should sound somewhat better. Yes, we have some electronic reeds that can be used for things like trumpet voluntary.
Right.
And please note, Gordon was playing that without any written music, purely from memory. Sometimes the way people's minds work, particularly in amateur radio, just takes the breath away. Anyway, to get back to Gordon, the late Gordon Smith, K7HFV, as of this week, sadly, here's a little more of Gordon at work, and also to do with his ham radio hobby, as an obituary for the late Gordon Smith, K7HFV.
Okay, this is the room in which we're about to have the talk.
Now, this was preparatory to a talk I gave on light beam communication at the Utah Amateur Radio Club, and of course I couldn't take a video during my talk with the room 2/3 full, but I did manage to take a little beforehand and a little afterwards, in which Gordon can be seen.
At the University of Utah.
There's Clint up the back, I think, bringing in a light beam communication device, or a friend of Clint's.
Yeah, there's some other people bringing it.
And Ron Jones, K7RJ.
It's a very cold night, lots of snow. May prejudice the numbers here.
But it didn't, fortunately. There's Gordon on the right, and there's Clint's light beam communication device. This was after the meeting, when people just were stragglers hanging back to ask questions. There's Clint K7HFV, a very good friend of Gordon's. Gordon, who died this week, unfortunately. There's Gordon in the blue shirt at the back, white light blue shirt. A very modest chap, and a great loss. We had a final dinner together at a local diner, and on the left there, Elaine and her husband on the extreme right, Ron Jones, K7RJ. Behind Elaine is Gordon Smith K7HFV, who's just passed away. Behind him again, Clint Turner K7OEI, and myself looking like a bit of a pixie with knife and fork raised, about to attack an American breakfast. And this was on the morning of my departure for Australia. They had a meet and greet and a farewell dinner, and this was it. Anyway, Vale Gordon Smith, K7HFV, the editor of the Utah Amateur Radio Club's magazine, The Microvolt, and a great asset to amateur radio. An endowment has been made in his name by ARRL, I believe, this week. This is VK3 Alpha Mike Lima with the regular Saturday night test transmission on 147.475 and concurrent YouTube live stream, which you can access if you want to see the video side of this by googling VK3AML 23 April 2022. And that will be the case every Saturday night. It'll be VK3AML and the date for accessing the YouTube live stream. As I mentioned before, the first general so-called high-definition television service offered anywhere in the world was not Britain or America. It was Germany, Nazi Germany. So I've managed to locate some footage of this, avoiding footage that was used for Michael Cloft's documentary Television Under the Swastika, which I suggest you look up on internet separately. But the Bundespost in 1935 made a documentary called The Eyes of the World, Das Auge der Welt, and from that, plus stills, which are rather clearer than this movie footage, I've been able to piece together a visual tour of the German television service as it was in 1935. 180 lines per picture, 25 pictures per second, sequentially scanned, no interlace scan, so it must have been not only rather blurry by modern standards, but flickery, but with no previous television service to compare it with. Who was going to complain, particularly with Mr. Hitler in charge? So let's have a look at that. The following films are from the Deutschen Bundespost Archive, Berlin. German television service began in Berlin at Witzleben on a 180-line, 25 pictures per second standard on the 22nd of March 1935. And here we are at the Brandenburg Gate in a very early colour film of Berlin. Nazi flags hanging everywhere. The Brandenburg Gate became the gate between East and West Berlin after the war. But this is at the height of Nazi ascendancy in Berlin. On the surface, very pretty. Underneath it could be very nasty, particularly if you were Jewish or non-Aryan. Now, At the western edge of the city, there was the Funkturm, the tower for broadcasting, and this is that broadcasting precinct as seen in colour in 1935. The tower there was half the height of the Eiffel Tower, was opened in 1926. It's entirely insulated from ground, so it could be run as a radio transmitting mast, as well as having a cafe halfway up and a booth for observation right at the top. You can still go up there, in spite of Allied attempts to blow up it during the war. They actually managed to remove one leg of the tower in 1945. It was reconstructed and stood firm. So it's still there, the Funkturm, the Eiffel Tower by comparison. Funkturm was only half the height, but it's in a fairly flat area in Witzleben, so it stands out. And you can see from this conceptual diagram of the broadcast system in Berlin that it was central to a network of studios providing very early form of a television service. The announcer's flying spot scanning booth, the bottom left, the film scanner on the left, the control room top left. They even had intermediate film touring trucks that could transmit from any locality around Berlin back into the studios and then out through that tower on low VHF. Remember, this is 1935, a good 18 months before the Alexandra Palace transmissions from London. And there is their equivalent of broadcasting house at the height of the Nazi era. Rather austere building. The Haus der Rundfunk. And that's where it was, on the western edge of Berlin. It's still there, along with the tower, where this first television service was given. Paul Nipkow was a German who devised the first viable scanning device, an optical device called a Nipkow disc. It was a disc perforated with a spiral of apertures. You'd focus the image onto a small part of the disc, and the apertures would allow the image to be scanned through to a photocell on the far side of the disc. And this was the basis of the first viable television cameras, right up to the time of the opening of the German television service in 1935. This is Paul Nipkow as he was in 1935, by then sort of the elder statesman of television engineers in Germany, highly regarded. And the German government made a present of one of the first production model television receivers, the Telefunken receiver, which you see on Paul Nipkow's right, on our left, in that photograph from 1935. Nipkow, with his wife, Frau Nipkow, were invited to the opening of the Berlin television service in 1935, but by the look on his face you can see that he's not tremendously impressed by the fact that he's having to rub shoulders with the Nazi brass, who are seen in the audience.
Achtung! Hier sind die Ultrakurzwellensender Berlin-Witzleben auf Welle 6,772 Meter für Bild und auf Welle 7,06 Meter für Ton.
And the German announcements were somewhat confronting, as you can see. The German head of broadcasting, Eugene Hadamowski, opened the station.
Mitarbeiter im Rundfunk vollziehen wir in diesem Augenblick auf deutschem Boden einen Kulturfortschritt, der einmal als die Krönung vieler technischer Einzelentwicklungen der letzten Jahrzehnte angesehen werden wird.
Of course, he was voicing the Nazi elite's propaganda, and in fact the service was not really intended for personal reception at home except by certain members of the Nazi elite. The idea was to transmit propaganda to shop venues provided with multiple seats and a single receiver, so that you would see the material that they were providing en masse, and that the propaganda message would therefore imprint itself on the mind more readily than in home reception. All very Orwellian. Anyway, this is the Witzleben Tower.
In Zusammenarbeit mit der Deutschen Reichspost aufgenommen, die bereits seit dem Jahre 1927 planmäßig an der Entwicklung der Fernsehtechnik arbeitet und auch heute für die technische Gestaltung des deutschen Fernsehens maßgebend ist.
Die Rundfunkdarbietungen werden bekanntlich auf elektrischen Wellen durch den Äther geschickt.
And the announcer is describing how the whole system works. The television transmission is on low VHF, 7 metres in wavelength, and that's the Telefunken receiver. Loudspeaker at the bottom, screen at the top. And there are several of these surviving in German museum collections, though they're very, very rare. They look surprisingly modern, considering these were made 87 years ago. That's the interior view. They're stacked with electronics. How they managed to dissipate all the heat from those valves is anybody's guess. I would guess that the circuitry would be fairly unreliable, given that they were running on 4 kV mains-derived EHT. The pictures also were fairly dim. There was no aluminizing at the back of the phosphors, as there was later on. So they would have been a greenish tint like an oscilloscope, and only 180 lines definition. But as you can see, designed for viewing by television parlours rather than in the home. This meant that you didn't have to have so many of these receivers produced to have an effect, a galvanising effect on public propaganda. So it wasn't really a public television service in the way that the British and American services were. There's the Telefunken set from 1935. Looks surprisingly modern. Other manufacturers soon got in on the act. The Lorenz Company produced this set, also 1935-36. They were immensely expensive. There were not too many people doing well in the Nazi regime, but they'd managed to produce some surprisingly good results, considering the maximum picture size was about 10 or 11 inches on the tubes that then could be available. Cathode ray tube technology was not very far advanced, and these sort of tubes were subject to implosion on regular basis. In fact, Manfred von Arden, one of the principal designers of television equipment in the early 1930s, told a story in a video interview of a visit being made to a German radio exhibition by Hitler and Goebbels, and they had just left the television viewing room when one of the tubes imploded with a sound that sounded like a bomb, in which case Mr. von Arden may have made a quick trip to a concentration camp, but no, it was very, very lucky. But the German establishment saw this as a great way of manipulating the masses in the longer term. Very Orwellian. Here the announcer describes the process of scanning from the film Das Auge der Welt, and he describes how the more coarse the pixel structure is, the more difficult it is to transmit a detailed image. And this is the way they scanned the image from top to bottom and left to right, conventionally. And they're showing there the pixels in the image. Originally there were 180 pixels or 180 lines in the image, providing 40,000 pixels per image. Now with the current pixel count, even on the live stream I'm giving, we have on 1080p over 2 million pixels, so this is a long way down the track now. But at the time, 180 lines was thought of as being a very high definition image, all very relative. And this shows how, as you speed it up, the persistence of vision of the eye will fill in the missing visual material. And here they show how flying spot scanning with an exploring light spot and a photocell down the bottom left to pick up the reflected light is capable of generating a video signal from the photocell by the reflected light. That can then be transmitted to a cathode ray tube at the receiving end, where the electron beam is synchronized to sweep across the face of the tube at the same time and in the same relative position. There's one of the very early CRTs used by the German television service, and this shows how the image can be broken down by scanning and then reassembled thanks to the effect of persistence of vision within the eye. Partly that and partly the persistence of glow of the phosphor, like that. This shows the system for flying spot scanning for announcing. They used to use this for single person announcing. That's their announcing booth, notably painted white so that reflected light will as much as possible enter the photocell. There's one of their announcers. They insisted on female announcers for both this and the early British television system. Brunette on the left there is Ursula Patschke, who you'll see shortly. And this is the flying spot scanning booth in action. That's the flying spot scanner itself. You can see the enclosure for the scanning disc on the right, and there's the sort of picture image they were getting, fairly blurry by modern standards. But the actual flying spot scanner was a masterpiece of mechanical engineering. The disc rotated, it was about 3 feet in diameter, about 1 metre in diameter, with a 180-hole spiral in it, cut to incredible accuracy and rotating in a vacuum, because in air, the edge of a disc rotating at 8,000 RPM would be close to reaching, I think, half the speed of sound and would create a lot of air drag. So both the motor driving the disc and the disc itself were operated in a partial vacuum, and a lot of that equipment is for pumping the air out. It was illuminated by an arc light, like a cinema projector, and that's the arc lamp house you see on the left.
Dass dies heute schon weitgehend möglich ist, davon werden Sie sich bei den
Sound
Fernsehübertragungen der
mixer.
Deutschen Reichspost überzeugen können.
Achtung, Achtung! Hier sind die Ultrakurzwellensender Berlin-Witzleben auf Welle 6,772 Meter für Bild und auf Welle 7,06 Meter für Ton. Das Reichspost-Zentralamt überträgt Fernsehversuchssendungen.
And here is the group in the television parlour looking in. An old bloke making some comment that he could hardly believe that he was seeing a person on the other side of Berlin. He gets laughed at, but to prove that she's actually on the other side of Berlin, the television demonstrator pulls a Swiftie, as you'll see.
sitzt im Fernsehlaboratorium der Reichspost in Witzleben. Sie können sich übrigens selbst davon überzeugen. Soll die Dame gleich mal anrufen? So, fein.
Hier Fernsehlaboratorium Witzleben.
Hier Fernsehstelle Nord.
Ach, da will wohl wieder jemand nicht glauben, dass die Fernsehübertragung echt ist.
Richtig. Erzählen Sie uns doch bitte einfach über den Sender, welche Möglichkeiten das Fernsehen bietet. Dann werden schnell alle Zweifel verstreut sein.
Sehr gern. Fangen wir also mit der unmittelbaren Übertragung an. Ich sitze hier in der Abtauchzelle des Fernsehlaboratoriums. Jeder Gegenstand, jede Person...
It must have been a bit strange being in that white booth with your face being explored by a spot of flickering light, but she managed to persuade her dog to say a few words.
Gib mal laut.
Zählen kann sie auch.
Wir können aber außer den Vorgängen in dieser Abtastzelle auch jedes andere bewegliche Bild übertragen. Beispielsweise jeden beliebigen Tonfilm, und zwar durch unser
And now she
Fernton-
demonstrates
Kinosender.
how films can be transmitted. This is their telecine machine. They bung a big roll of 35mm movie film on, thread it down through the continuous scanning gate, which projects the light onto a scanning disc. Arc lamp struck behind, arc lamp illuminating the disc through the film. There's a clearer view of the telecine, which really was a piece of work. Again, the scanning disc rotating in a partial vacuum. And to think that we can do that all in terms of scanning with an SDHD card today, demonstrating the sort of films that they put on.
Beherbergen die Völker.
Im Film haben wir zugleich das
And not only could they
Mittel,
transmit films and
künstlerische Darbietungen,
announcements,
zum Beispiel Opernaufführungen.
they also had a television
Im Freien und in
telephone
geschlossenen Räumen
booth
durch den Fernsehsender
set up
zu
for
übertragen.
demonstration purposes, which you'll see in a moment.
Man nennt diese Art der Fernsehübertragung das Zwischenfilmverfahren. Die Vorgänge werden zunächst auf gewöhnlichen Kinofilm aufgenommen.
This is their travelling film van. That film camera at the top can feed exposed film down into that truck where the film was developed in tanks, fixed and then put in front of a scanning disc, all within 60 seconds. And that was actually used at the 1936 Berlin Olympics. That's the interior of the truck with the developing tanks and the scanning system. An extraordinary piece of mechanical engineering which only the Germans could have probably handled. Again, a view of the truck. Film goes through the camera, recording sound at the same time in the
Der
camera,
Filmstreifen läuft aus der oberen Kassette am Objektiv vorbei.
and it gets fed down into a developing tank,
Im Aufnahmewagen wird der Film dann sofort
threaded back and forth so that it has a time to go through developer, then into the fixing tank, back and forth, and then while still wet and dripping, it goes in front of a scanning gate and a scanning disc on the right, and finally gets dried and kept as a pre-recorded television program for future use.
Es sind schon Ferngespräche möglich, bei denen sich beide Partner gegenseitig sehen können.
And this is the television telephone that was set up in Berlin as a demonstration system in 1935. Again, you go into a white booth with flying spot scanning and they link you with audio and video across Berlin.
Hallo?
Tag Helga. Na siehst du, da bin ich selbst.
Na wunderbar. Und wie deutlich. Du, ich sehe sogar, dass dein Schlips wieder mal nicht sitzt.
Oh, das würde.
And that's an actual picture of the televised picture from a magazine.
So weit ist die Fernsehtechnik heute schon fortgeschritten. Nichts bleibt im Auge des Fernsehsenders verborgen. Der Fernsehsender ist das Auge der Welt.
Television is the eyes of the world, she says.
Wird an der weiteren Vervollkommnung des Fernsehens
And now some
gearbeitet.
film of the fabrication of early cathode ray
Alle
tubes,
Volksgenossen am Fernsehen
which
teilnehmen.
apparently would explode on more than one
Beim Fernsehen
occasion.
bedient man sich der Ultrakurzwellen, die eine gewisse Ähnlichkeit
A
mit den
demonstration of
Lichtwellen haben.
how, for VHF, the height of the antenna
sehr
bore a
beeindruckend.
relationship to the range of the television transmissions. People weren't used to VHF
Die
then.
Reichweite nimmt aber mit der Sichtweite zu und ist daher umso größer. je
A
höher
higher
die Antenne
antenna will
des
cover a
Fernsehsenders
larger area,
moderiert
but I
wird.
think the area here is a bit
Um die
exaggerated.
Ausbreitungsverhältnisse der Fernsehwellen genauer zu erforschen,
Today
hat die
Berlin,
Deutsche
tomorrow's the
Reichspost einen
world.
aus 12
What they're showing here
fahrbaren Fernsehsender
are
gebaut.
transmitting cars going up the Brocken, one of the highest mountains near Berlin, with the idea of relaying the signal for transmission very long distances right across Germany. I'm not quite sure that they ever got this working properly, because the war, of course, intervened only 4 years later. And thereafter, television was rather of secondary importance, although the Germans did establish a television station in Paris during their occupation, 1940, 41, 42. So that's a little of the background to the establishment of the German television service on the 180-line system in 1935. This is VK3 Alpha Mike Lima with the regular Saturday night test transmission. And now going back to the local camera. Thank you. Most of that film was from the Deutsche Bundespost archive. It was from a film called The Eyes of the World, Das Auge der Welt, and made in 1935. I'll just check that we've got no copyright issues. Good, very good. This is VK3AML testing, hopefully. We'll move on now to the BBC case. In 1936, towards the end of 1936, the BBC managed to pull the digit out and get their 405 line system going from the Alexandra Palace, which was in the north of London, on a high point. It's still there, well worth visiting if you ever get to London to have a look at where British television began. But a documentary called Television Comes to London was made in 1936. Unfortunately, the only copy I could source was 320p. I've done my best to upscale this to 1080, but it's still not great quality, but I have been able to improve considerably the quality of the soundtrack, which is very woofy in the initial instance. So let's have a look at the establishment of the British television system, the British television service, in November 1936. This shows the construction of the station at Alexandra Palace and its first transmissions on the air. November 1936, opening of 405 line TV from the Alexandra Palace, London.
The selection of a site for the first television station presented many difficulties of which the public know little. Eventually, the Alexandra Palace was chosen. This playground of northeast London was a relic of Victorian times. It is, as you see, decorated in the style of the period and stands in a park of almost 200 acres, 350 feet above sea level, commanding a wonderful view over London. It has been used for many years past as a setting for concerts, exhibitions, and circuses. In November 1935, the work of reconstruction was begun on the southeast wing. To convert the old palace into the headquarters of the latest miracle in electrical communication, complete reconstruction was necessary, so that the building might house the transmitters, control rooms, studios, and all the complicated apparatus of the two television systems. The basement had to be cleared, rafters had to be dismantled, walls had to be demolished. Girders were cut away, and some of these old cast iron girders were very tough. It took hours to cut them through. A modern steel girder of this size could be severed in about 10 minutes. They built solidly in the Victorian days. It took many hours of careful work to lower these great heavy beams to ground level and run them out onto the main terrace in front of the palace. From there, they were hoisted into lorries and taken away. When the old shell had been gutted, nothing much beyond the main walls and floors were left. The plans for reconstruction had, of course, been made long beforehand, and while demolition was still going on in one part of the building, the concrete mixers were already preparing the new cement foundations for another. The ground floor had to be made solid enough to bed heavy generators and rotary converters, which are part of the transmitting equipment. In the Baird transmitting hall alone, there are 12 heavy motor generators. Meanwhile, new walls grew up and old ones were made good and plastered. The foundations were excavated to carry the water supply necessary to cool the transmitter valves and to make room for the modern drainage necessary for dressing rooms and bathrooms. Ceilings were replastered. Part of the balcony on the main facade was enclosed to make room for additional apparatus. The southeast tower itself was gutted and completely redesigned to hold 5 floors of modern offices. For weeks, the bricks were being hoisted up the tower, and gradually this part of the work began to take shape. At last they were complete, and the bricklayers pointed the exterior walls to make them proof against the weather. It was at about this time that Vladimir Zworykin, originator of the television camera, visited the director of television at Alexandra Palace. Mr. John Logie Baird is well known as the pioneer of British television. Here is some of the Baird apparatus: the transmitting valves, the spotlight scanner, the spotlight studio, in which photo cells take the place of lights, and the telecine projection room with the projector in course of erection. The film is here being threaded from the magazine and down through the gate. The cathode ray tubes being packed and baked under covers to guard those doing the work against implosion. Meanwhile, at the Marconi EMI factory at Hayes, the glass flasks, which form the basis of the Emitron camera, are being assembled. An opening at one end of the tube is gradually enlarged with a carbon rod so that a further glass tube can be joined on. The mosaic inside the tube, when scanned by a cathode ray, transforms the optical image thrown upon it into a series of electrical impulses. The flask, with various projections upon it, each carrying an electrical connection, is joined up to a mercury vacuum pump for exhaustion. The gases remaining in the metal parts being driven out by heat. The complete tube is then mounted above its own amplifier, which forms the base of the electron camera. The hood, carrying the optical lens, is placed in position.
I'll just point out something here. This is VK3AML testing, as usual, Saturday night. When the Emitron camera, the first electronic television camera for high-def, well, 405 line, in 1936 was developed, nobody had thought to put a viewfinder on the damn thing. You'll see that there's a hole on the right of the main lens, and that's to peer through at the image on the iconoscope plate. Surely not the best way of lining this up. This is what happens when engineers, rather than photographers, design a television system. It was soon corrected, and if you see the photos of the early Emitron camera in actual usage after the first couple of months of the Alexandra Palace, they had a Sidewinder viewfinder on, but not this developmental model. Back to the film.
This lens racks forward for focus so that the complete Emitron can be used like a cinema camera. Here in the experimental studios at Hayes, Emitron cameras are being tested. In one studio, a close-up is being taken of one of the members of the staff. And her picture comes up on the television monitor. Meanwhile, the coaxial cable is being tested by the post office engineers. This coaxial cable is destined to carry television from the heart of London up to the transmitter. The cable is hauled through ducts at Alexandra Palace and greased to make it slide more easily down the manholes and through the pipes which carry it. Length by length, it is pulled through. The generators we spoke of earlier are here seen mounted on their concrete beds. The leads are being joined up from the mains. A motor is fitted and installed. And preparations for the mast proceed. Here is the great winch which hauls the girders up to the roof of the building, from where they are hoisted one by one to take their places in the orderly erection of the mast.
Okay, I'm going to have to stop that there because I've just received an attention that a part of that image is copyrighted, so we'll have to skip forward. You'll have to take my word for it that there's a film of the start of the service. But let's skip forward to the USA, 1939. This is a film of television taken by RCA in 1939 showing the methods then in usage in America. They hadn't had a proper broadcast service starting at that stage. This was all purely experimental with the intention of launching a service, but this gives you some idea of what the situation was like. This is from an upload from the National Archives of America, so should be in public domain. Let's go over to that.
After 10 years of experiment, television, first shown to the public at the World's Fair, now takes its place as a new American art and industry. With the inauguration of regular television broadcast from NBC, one of the RCA services, set owners in metropolitan New York enjoy the novel experience of receiving pictures through the air. But an examination of the set contributes little to an understanding of the subject. Except for the screen and slanted mirror that reflects the image to the audience, it is much like a radio in appearance. But in the RCA Victor laboratories, where television equipment has been developed, we get a better view of the tubes that have added two new words to our vocabularies: the iconoscope for the camera and the kinescope for the receiver. The iconoscope is mounted behind the lens in this crude laboratory camera. The lens focuses the image of the experimental chart upon a metal plate in the tubes, and the iconoscope turns the image into electricity. In a nearby laboratory receiver, the kinescope tube is inserted. This tube receives the electrical impulses created in the iconoscope tube and recreates the image. As the tube is turned on, we see the pattern of the scanning beam of electrons that moves back and forth across its face over 13,000 times a second and carries the electrical impulses that create the picture. In the laboratory, the iconoscope and kinescope are connected by wire. But in actual broadcast, the NBC television transmitter atop the Empire State Building sends the program out from this antenna by imposing it on a very short radio wave, which acts as a carrier for both the picture and sound. These short radio waves travel only in a straight line and cannot follow the Earth's surface. Therefore, the limit of television is the distance from the antenna to the horizon. From the Empire State Building, a program can be sent only as far as the eye can see on a perfectly clear day. In New York, programs are sent to the transmitter over a special cable from the television studios in Radio City, 3/4 of a mile away, or are sent by radio to the transmitter by the mobile units, which cover sporting events, outdoor celebrations, and spot news of all kinds. A mobile television unit consists of two large trucks. One of these is a rolling control room and amplifier, and the other is a small radio transmitter which sends the program over the air to the main transmitter in the Empire State Building. Typical of programs covered by the mobile television units is a horse race, and this unit pulls into the racetrack early in the morning to start the elaborate preparations of setting up to cover the race. In the rear of one truck are reels of the special coaxial cable that carries the picture from the camera to the trucks. While this is dragged out, engineers raise the antenna on top of the truck from which the program will be broadcast, and the cameramen set up the portable iconoscope camera atop the grandstand. Inside the truck, equipment is tested, and the coaxial cable is raised to the roof of the stand to connect camera and trucks. With a connection made, the camera is turned on for a test, and engineers stand by as race time approaches. Then on top of the stand, announcer Clem McCarthy takes his place beside the television camera, and the program goes on the air.
Judge Hasten on the extreme outside keeps stepping out of his stall, delaying the start as the 12 thoroughbreds line up at the gate. Now they're all in there and behaving nicely. Look out, they're off. Interpreter number 2 breaks in front, and as the field races past the stands, it's Interpreter on top with Suncracks in second place. The field is closely bunched as they rush to the first turn, but they've a long way to go. It's still anybody's race. Down the back stretch, Suncracks is dropping back, and as they turn into the home stretch, Albert D leads by 2 lengths with Mondu at second ahead of a closely bunched field. Down the stretch, Albert D turns on more speed. He increases his lead. He's too fast for Monduit, and Albert D by 4 lengths is the winner.
As in radio, many television programs will come from the specially equipped studios such as this one in Radio City. Here, under the bright lights required for indoor broadcasts, preparations are underway to televise an orchestral program. The special lights of the television studios are placed under the direction of the cameraman. Most of these lights are suspended from the ceiling and controlled by cords, by means of which they can be raised, lowered, or turned by a technician on the floor below. In the control booth above the studio, the program director and engineers prepare for their part in the broadcast. Here, the picture and sound are amplified for their trip to the transmitter, and the quality is checked on a viewing screen. Cameramen and engineers wear earphones through which they receive instructions throughout the broadcast from the director. As the first step in the program, the title camera is trained on the printed titles, and these are sent out over the air. Then, at a signal from the director, the television broadcast gets underway. Each of the cameras used in this broadcast is making a different angle of the same scene. This long shot camera is permanently placed to get a view of the entire orchestra. A second camera on a wheeled truck is used to make close-ups of the orchestra and its individual members, and this is rolled around the studio during the broadcast. On the screen in the control room, we see a scene made by the close-up camera. After this has run for a few seconds, the control engineer switches over to the other camera, and the scene changes to a long shot of the entire orchestra. The director manipulates the cameras to keep the scene changing and to avoid monotony, instructing the cameramen and engineers by telephone as the program progresses.
All right, switch to one. Now roll into a close-up of the string section. Now pan across the orchestra from the brass to the strings. Now back to your original position and pan over to include the conductor.
And so a new American industry has been born. Television is taking its place as another important and vital contribution to our daily lives. It is a modern miracle, a new public service produced by combining RCA laboratory science with manufacturing skill. The research problem of yesterday is the radio marvel of today. Another milestone of progress has been passed, and science has made a reality of the age-old dream of pictures from the sky.
And now, leaping forward about 6 years to the end of the Second World War, a survey from the closing months of World War II from the USA Army Navy Screen magazine.
What's tomorrow going to be like? What kind of world are we going to live in when we get our permanent furloughs? Super-speed highways, plastic Packards, streamlined cities. What does the future hold in store for us? To get a glimpse of that future, Army-Navy Screen Magazine presents a new department, Tomorrow, previewing our post-war world, the job opportunities, the new fields ahead. For the first in our Tomorrow series, let's look into a brand new development. Television. Here's an expert with the lowdown on the inside facts. Dr. Orestes Caldwell, editor of Electronic Industries and former member of the Federal Communications Commission.
I'm glad to have this opportunity to speak to you men and women in the service of America. I believe in this world to come. I think it's going to be a pretty good world. But I've been asked to tell you about television, so I'll trim the philosophizing. Television is most certainly here to stay. It's going to brighten the world of your home. But more important to many of you, it's going to create a lot of new jobs. Now, none of us like crystal gazing, so let's take a look at what is actually happening now. 9 experimental telecasting studios are already operating with pre-war equipment and skeleton staffs. While the electronic industry is busy finishing its war job, a handful of people, girls, ex-vets, older men, are keeping the television field alive, experimenting, ironing out kinks, but proving that television will definitely be part of American life when the go-ahead comes. Sight teamed up with sound to bring the world to your easy chair. Telecasting studios will be a combination of Broadway and Hollywood.
I'll just stop that there to say this is VK3AML testing on 147.475 and also on YouTube live stream. If you want to see the video that goes with this sound, please Google VK3AML 23 April 2022. That is, Google the phrase VK3AML 23 April 2022 and you should get our live stream with the historical video. This is documentary material related to the birth of television. This particular film dates from the early months of 1945, just before the end of the Second World War, when equipment in studios that had been built pre-war experimentally was being maintained in the expectation of a broadcast service occurring after the war, which of course it did.
And you'll get the best of both for the price of your television set and a few cents worth of electricity. And outside the studios, mobile televising units, portable stations on wheels, are now experimenting with remote pickups, getting primed to bring you on-the-spot news and history in the making. When television networks are formed, you will have a direct wire to every place a television camera can be set up. A world of sports at your fingertips.
They're off. That's interpreter number 2 right in front. And the field races past the stand with interpreter on top, low man in second place moving up on the outside.
Mayor LaGuardia pitches the first ball. Red Ruffing is taking his time, and it's a hit.
There's a capacity crowd here at Madison Square Garden tonight to witness the semifinals of the Golden Glove.
Telecasting is done on a limited schedule now. But tomorrow, you will have a permanent ringside seat everywhere from Madison Square Garden to the House of Congress. You'll see transmitted by television, newsreels, and Super Hollywood productions. Plays and musicals, command performances in your own living room. These men at Halloran General Hospital, where there are 100 sets, can tell you television is here to stay. Even now, without the technical improvements that will come after the war, the television picture has the quality of a good home movie. The pre-war models in use today have a small screen, but here's a practical working model with a 16 by 22-inch screen that goes into production just about the time you're being measured for civvies.
This is NBC, the National Broadcasting Company. WNBT, New York.
Well, that gives you a pretty general idea of what's happening. Now let's see how television works. You're going to find a new type of aerial against the skyline of America when you return. It will be up high because television waves, like light rays, don't bend and are stopped by the horizon. So the higher the aerial, the farther the waves travel. But first, what is a television wave? As you know, all objects reflect light. some more, some less, depending on their color. The white jacket of these fencers is reflecting more light than their dark trousers. The television camera lens, like an ordinary camera, picks up these differences in light and shadow. Only instead of film behind the lens, we have the iconoscope, familiarly known as Ike. The camera plate of the iconoscope is made up of millions of sensitive electric eyes. These eyes pick up electric impulses from the object being televised and form a picture which is then transmitted as separate electric impulses from the camera plate to the receiver screen. There, the impulses are converted back to pinpoints of light and shadow to reform the picture on the screen. Here, the process is slowed down for you. Actually, the impulses travel from the camera to the receiving set at the rate of 4 million impulses a second, forming the picture in motion. Fantastic. But our children will grow up with this miracle enriching their lives and giving them a new understanding of the whole world.
Gosh.
By harnessing electrons and vacuum tubes, our research scientists, backed by American industry and manufacturing skill, have developed this new means of communication to the point where it promises to become a post-war billion-dollar industry which can serve our nation and the world in new and wonderful ways. Let's listen to a man who knows. He is one of the great leaders in the world of electronics, Brigadier General Sarnoff, President of the Radio Corporation of America.
When the First World War ended, it was my good fortune and privilege to play a part in the launching and subsequent development of a new industry called broadcasting. There were some who said it had great promise. There were others who said that it was a noisy, sputtering gadget, a passing fancy. The rest, you know. Now let us see what possibilities exist for television once the war ends.
Here are the possibilities. In the manufacturing field, 60,000 men and women will be needed to make the first sets, which will retail for about $200, with 18 million Americans ready to buy them. Help wanted. Electronic experts, assemblers, wiremen, machinists, finishers, testing personnel, sheet metal workers, drill press operators, spot welders. Television is just made to order for GIs with radio and radar experience. 85,000 maintenance men are going to be needed to install and service the 30 million sets expected to be sold within the first 10 years of full-scale production. And in the distribution end of the business, 135,000 jobs are going to open up in the new shops and sales organizations that will supply the huge consumer demand. All in all, 300,000 well-paying jobs are expected to be created by television within 5 years after the new industry really gets rolling. Well, that's a comprehensive view of the industrial picture. Now what about television production? Here's a man who qualifies as an expert on that subject. Meet Mr. Gilbert Seldes, head of production of the Columbia Broadcasting System.
They tell me that a great many of you may be interested in jobs in television production. But I think you're entitled to the hard, solid facts in the case. As of spring 1945, we are employing 62 people. They work a full week to put on 4 hours of programs on the air. That doesn't mean 4 hours a day, it means 4 hours a week. If we were on the air 8 hours a day, 7 days a week, we'd need at least 7 times as many people, in the neighborhood of 500. And we're only one studio. There are 900 radio broadcasting stations in the United States today. And it's anybody's guess how many television stations are going to spring up. We can just be sure that the faster we deliver good entertainment and good pictures, the more jobs we're going to create. And there will be a lot of jobs. You compare television with radio, for instance. Here is a radio newscaster on the air. One man in the studio, one in the control room. And here is a television newscast. And a lot of work went into it before it got this far. Now as for the movies. Here is just a medium colossal production underway. Yes, it takes a lot of people and many months to make one. Yet commercial television will probably use more material in 1 week than all the studios in Hollywood turn out in a year. And finally, in the theater, you produce a show, it may run for years. In television, every night is opening night and closing night too. Now let's look at some specific television jobs. Some of them you'll see come from radio, movies, and the theater. Some are new. Here are 2 men doing a job never heard of before. They are riding the Ike. Shaders and switchers in the control room see that the pictures come out right. At the transmitter, they see that they get out on the air. And electronic experts keep it all functioning. You men with radio and radar training are only a hop, skip, and jump from the industry's needs. Then there will be modifications of established professions. Writers, directors, producers, scenic designers, and just to show you wax, waves, and spars that this isn't exclusively a man's world, there'll be costume designing and stage management. Then behind the scenes, makeup, props, electricians, and almost everything else from carpenters to model makers. But the great thing to remember is that we've just begun to discover the possibilities of television. And these are only a few of the jobs that already exist. Many more are bound to develop as we go on.
That's it. Television. And some interesting jobs which some of you may be qualified for. But more than that, television can be the window to the whole world. A medium through which the United Nations can better understand each other and live together in the world of tomorrow.
And next week we'll continue that with Stepping Along with Television, a documentary made in the 50s taking us up to the period of colour. This is VK3AML going back on camera. VK3 Alpha Mike Lima on 147.475 if you want to tune in on the video component of this live stream. Please Google the phrase VK3AML 23 April 2022. Okay, we're still 5 minutes from the normal opening time for a QSO, but I'll call CQ on 147.475 on this transmitter down here. Incidentally, it's an FT7900. Just to fill in a bit of time, I should mention the way it's being operated. The more recent VHF FM rigs have what they call a digital input on the back, accessible through a DIN socket. What that gives you is an input to the voltage-controlled oscillator, the modulator of those rigs, without the frequency response tailoring normally given to a hand microphone, which is intended for usage in frequently noisy environments with lots of rumble, such as in the cabs of cars. So if you use the digital input on the back of the radio, you can achieve modulation down as low as you like. I think I've measured it down to 10 Hertz at the 3 dB point, and with a reasonable bandwidth receiver, you can get 8 kilohertz worth of audio back out the receiving end by using the digital output, which is directly coupled from the discriminator and the receiver of the rig. So by using that input rather than the normal microphone input, you can bypass a lot of the tailoring and filtering, and then produce the filtering and tailoring yourself with a graphic equalizer, as I'm doing here, or with a mixer system. I'll just pull the camera off its normal mount, turn it round. There's our 8-channel mixer. Device on the right is a coupling device to allow me to record or play back through the system. Then the graphic equalizer. That's the audio compressor limiter, actually in limiting mode. If I hello, you can see it limiting when the red lights come on. Hello. And just a monitor amplifier down the back, a rather old one from the 70s. But that's the response tailoring we've got. We've got mid-range treble and bass, and ultra high available for adjustment on the mixer there. So that kills a bit of time up to our normal QSO time. Put that back on its mounting. Okay, now we'll call CQ on 147.475. Hopefully some of our regulars are out there for a chat. And so this is VK3AML. Oh, I have to change my monitoring. I don't listen off air when I'm doing that. And now we've got monitoring off the 2 metre rig. VK3AML calling CQ on 147.475 and standing by for any calls.
VK3 Alpha Charlie Zulu.
And VK3 ECG.
Okay, we've got Peter, VK3 ACZ, and Dave, VK3 ECG. Have we got any other takers for the, well, effectively it's a callback, but in practice a QSO. VK3AML, standing by. No, just the two. Okay, no problem. Peter, how's your week been? And I hope things are going okay with your efforts in Belgrave Heights on field days and such. VK3ACZ and group, VK3AML.
VK3AML in the group, VK3ACZ. Good evening, Chris. Good evening, Dave and listeners. Yes, well, with the solar flux up at 163 at the moment, it's been very, very good, but more about that in my second round. I'd like to start first with saying that, well, put in my apologies for the first part of your broadcast. I was at a 21st birthday party and I was itching to get out of the place, and it took an eternity for the food to arrive. When it did, it was about 2,200 hours, so I was driving down the hill from Upway listening to you on my handheld, and you did a great job of describing things like the talking German dog and such like. I couldn't wait to get on the live stream to see the visual images. I loved seeing the Chrysler building with the antennas on the top of it in New York City, and had a bit of a chuckle when Brigadier General Sarnoff said, some people say it's a noisy, spluttering gadget. And I thought to myself, yes, will TV ever catch on? Oh no, Chris, I spend too much time nostalgically remembering how I used to run home from primary school to sit down in front of the Many Loves of Dobie Gillis and my wonderful black and white television, and what memories it all brings back. So I owe it to myself to watch the first part of your stream broadcast later on, which I will do. But anyway, thank you again for giving us a good glimpse into television and the marvellous invention that it's been. Enough for the first over. Back to you, Chris. Hope your week's been good. VK3AML in the group, VK3ACZ.
Yeah, it's been pretty good. Prue's now home from hospital and getting steadily back on her feet, although I'm still making all of the dinners. Just hang on a sec. Bring up my level a bit. We've had a few glitches along the way. She's wearing a moon boot, and I'm getting used to how much pressure to put on the various straps on a moon boot. It used to be that if you had that sort of a sprain, you'd be put in a full plaster, but apparently the medical authorities now favour a strap-in situation where you can get your leg out of the device at night when you're not moving very much, lying in bed, and that saves all of the itching and all the other disadvantages that plaster had, including having to be sawn off at the end. Dobie Gillis, eh? Gosh. Most of the stars of that show have passed on. Dwayne Hickman, who was Dobie Gillis, died about 6 months ago. Maynard G. Krebs, who was played by the guy who played Gilligan on Gilligan's Island, died years ago. But one of the most active people from that show was the girl who played Zelda. And she's now an activist in the gay rights movement in America. She was, actively dating apparently a girl while on the Dobie Gillis program, but of course she had to cover it up completely, as most gay people had to in those days. So now, having come out, she's become a politician. I think she's in her early 80s now, but she's still got that same perky personality that she had 60 years ago when that show was in production. Chrysler Building. I wonder if on the next round you could tell us whether you've ever been to New York, Peter. That's someplace I haven't been to. The only glitch we had tonight was that about halfway through the BBC film called Television Comes to London, suddenly I got a copyright infringement pop-up, so I immediately flicked forward. And wouldn't you know it, all of the stuff from the American National Archives is out of copyright-free. The Brits are so punctilious with their stuff. German stuff, the problem doesn't arise. It's just the British. The BBC is so bloody-minded on these things, yet in the days when they could have preserved a lot of their programming, early Doctor Who's, a series that I watched avidly as a kid, made by the BBC, called A for Andromeda, which was one of the first programs that Julie Christie made an appearance in. Apparently only one complete episode of A for Andromeda has survived, and even that survived because a private person managed to get onto a Kinney recording of it and snaffled it. The rest of it's lost. BBC, a bit like the ABC in the old days, very hidebound by public service requirements and not too much sense in terms of throwing away stuff that had cost an awful lot to produce. So it's round to Dave. And how's your week been, Dave? VK3CG and group VK3AML.
Yeah, VK3AML group, VK3ECG, and good evening, Peter. Yes, it's been a pretty good week, really. Tapping away at the keys, trying to get some few reports out, and unfortunately it logs you into court appearances later on, but otherwise that's all gone fairly well. Bit of singing, went out again and portable and tried out a different antenna, but I must say I don't think I was doing quite as well as I was with the dipole. I was trying actually a very old sort of flower pot type 20-metre antenna that I'd got ages and ages and ages ago, no longer available, I think, and I had actually bought some coax to build one myself, and I actually still have the bits sort of almost finished off, so I thought I'd try this thing out, and I worked a couple of Italian stations, but really I was not able to get the sort of signal that I was getting out on the dipole, which was a little soda beams thing that I had, and as I got a couple of years ago, and was a very, very nice arrangement. So I used that the other weekend when I had a bit more success, and then I was I just had a mast, and then I used the ends of the dipole effectively to the ground, but obviously with a length of cable and so on, just so the ends weren't near the ground, and then up on a pole, and then the a third backstay, and then just angling the dipole very slightly, it gave you enough support for the pole. So no guys needed, which was really good. So that all worked very nicely. Glad the Prue's back, and obviously, yes, moon boots are a bit of fun, aren't they? Well, anything's better than plaster. I think that's the go. Obviously, there are occasions when you need plaster, but Yes, those plaster saws are great fun. I use them a fair bit actually, but they're vibrating saws, so they don't actually spin. They look as if they're spinning, but in fact you can hold the blade with your fingers. In fact, that's what I used to do, and guide it. It just vibrates a bit, and most of those sort of things like that are vibrating. So the great advantage of vibrating things is that if they do touch the skin, they don't actually cut you. It just vibrates the skin, whereas anything that's hard, like plaster and so on, gets cut. So that's the difference. And of course they pad them with cotton wool and things like that anyway. But they're quite interesting, those old things. Yes, I do vaguely remember Alpha and Andromeda, or at least I remember the book and things like that. But can't remember the show very much, I have to say. The fun thing I used to remember with Peter saying, going crushing over in school to see these things, was I had school on Saturdays, which was mostly sports actually, which I didn't particularly like. I did everything I could to get out of sports, and I'd come home, and I remember it was my first real experience of teleprinters, because on the BBC, on a Saturday afternoon, all the football results came in, and they had a camera pointing at a teleprinter, and the teleprinter would be rattling away, and it would, say West Bromwich Albion, 1 and Tottenham Hotspurs 2 or something like that, and it would be just literally come out from the teleprinter, and the camera would be following this on the screen while the commentators made some comments about who won and what things drew, and of course the footy pools competition and so on will be going as well. Everyone will be ticking off their things to see the no draw scores and things like that, no score draws rather, and so there was it was funny. I used to sit, and I had no real interest in sports at all, but I just remember sort of having snacks and just watching this teleprinter and hoping that the sport thing would finish so I could watch something else. But there we are. Anyway, back to you, and thank you very much for this evening. It was fascinating. I enjoyed the organ, but I'll come back to the organ a bit later on. Okay, back to you, Chris. VK3AML and the group VK3ECG.
Just before we go on, does anybody else like to join the group? VK3AML, standing by. No more takers. I'll have to push this net a bit more strongly on Facebook and whatnot. I haven't had that much time to do any advance announcements of early television material on the page. I'll just have a look for a moment on the commentary. There's a bit of a debate going on, one or two people, one in particular, about material that I transmitted some weeks back, dealing with the human misery dropout of the Ukrainian war, specifically people who were suffering in the Ukraine, a little bit of what we could do about it, a little bit of exactly how they're dealing with it in terms of escape from their country. And somebody said this is politics, shouldn't be on amateur radio. I'm afraid we have a basic difference of agreement in what constitutes politics if you think that human rights and human misery is something we shouldn't talk about. We also have a situation at the moment where CQ magazine, the RSGB, and QRZ.com have taken action against Russian amateurs, particularly taking part in local ham radio competitions on the same basis that Russia has been banned from sporting events in those NATO or Western countries. So much as we might like to say that ham radio is politics free, when it comes to human rights, ham radio is a major go-to point for emergency communication, and I think we have to keep that in mind And if it steps over into politics, well, that's not my definition of politics. That's my definition of human rights and emergency need. So if you come onto the text chat complaining about the content of this program, just remember I do it for nothing. You are not paid to be here. You're welcome to leave. It's a case, I think, of some people using something that they get for nothing as a means of criticism. I don't take kindly to that. So the people who do it on a constant basis will find themselves blocked from further access to the text chat. It's the only way I can deal with that sort of aggravation. My apologies, but if that goes on, if there are constant reminders of differences, the differences will be dealt with electronically. Now, getting back to Peter, the Chrysler building, Dobie Gillis. The last repeat of Dobie Gillis I can remember on black and white TV was about 1965. I think it ceased production about 1962. And I couldn't understand the lovey-dovey stuff when I was about 8 when it first ran, but I certainly found the antics of Maynard G. Krebs hilarious. The Beatnik. And it hit the mark in reflecting the tenor of the times, I suppose, that changeover period from the easygoing attitudes of the 50s to the questioning of values that went on in the 60s. It was really in the interstice between the two. An interesting series. Oh, and Peter, a thought for you. I was thinking about how the flowerpot antenna could be improved. It's just a dipole, of course, has no gain. But I thought of this would be complicated, and you need to suitably aligned trees to do it from, but you could tie a non-conductive material, a rope, between two trees, and if you could somehow drop a dipole, your flowerpot antenna, from the middle of that, and then either side of it dangle from the rope a reflector slightly longer than the dipole and a director slightly shorter than the dipole, you would have 3 wires hanging which could be rolled up and carted away afterwards. So it would be possible on that basis, if you fiddled about a bit, to make a 3-element beam out of a flowerpot antenna. Okay, round to Peter, VK3ACZ, VK3AML and group.
VK3AML in the group, VK3ACZ. And that's very creative thinking of you there to come up with a beam for the flowerpot. I tell you what, it did so well today, you'd hardly need any gain, but more about that shortly. I want to approach your definition of politics on amateur radio too, and offer a little bit of moral support for you. My idea of politics is if you want to ridicule me for not aligning myself with a particular party, or you want to instruct me to join or be aligned with a particular party, or do any kind of advertising for a political party, that to me is politics. I side with you completely, and your definition of it, and talking about human misery and the awful things that are happening in the world. We can all put our heads in a bucket of sand if we want to. Now, going back a bit, A for Andromeda, yeah, that's a fractionally before my time, because I remember seeing it in the TV guide. Didn't actually watch it, but I can assure you that the last run of The Many Loves of Dobie Gillis was only a month ago on my television set. Hi. I've got the DVD series of it, and I love it, and it hardly dates at all, and I appreciated it just as much now as I did then. And yes, Maynard G. Krebs. The G stood for Walter, an aunt of his. His father would pay his airfare anywhere in the whole world one way. And who could forget work or married, the way he used to squeal when those things were mentioned. New York City. Yes, I've been to New York 4 times. It's, I think, a big, dirty, filthy, smelly sewer, but I love it. I absolutely love the place. Central Park is astounding, that you're in the middle of one of the most populous cities in the world, and yet you might as well be in the middle of the wilderness. There are squirrels running around everywhere. There's a raccoon or two in every single tree. There are turtles or tortoises, whichever they are, in the lakes in Central Park. And I found it amazing how the city of a night, you walk around and those black rubbish bags were full to about 10 foot tall all over the sidewalk, as they call it, not footpaths, sidewalks, and they mysteriously disappeared sometime around midnight, but you never saw the garbage trucks. And the other thing about New York is that they used to forecast the snowfalls down to the exact hour. And my first thought was, oh yeah, sure, right. But no, you'd look out the window of the hotel and yes, it would snow exactly when the weatherman said it would. And I suppose that's because most of their weather comes across land, so it's easier to predict than what we're used to, where some of it is coming through the Great Australian Bight and therefore slightly less predictable. And you mentioned the moon boot. Oh, brought back memories. My loved one and I were in London, and we went, actually she went round the world with a moon boot on because she'd had an ankle operation. And I don't know, somebody must have thought, oh, has she found a boot or lost one? But we were at the Greenwich Observatory and all things, and a woman walked past, stopped, pointed and laughed at her boot. And all I could feel was sad for the poor woman, who obviously hadn't had much suffering of her own, or it was yet to come, because I do believe life is a great leveller. Now, what was the other thing? Oh, yes, Dave, you mentioned going out portable and getting to Italy. I wondered if that was with your IC705 or not. And just a quick word, Chris, if I may, about propagation. I said before, you know, the solar flux index is way up. I got to El Salvador yesterday on 10 metres, Italy this afternoon on 10, but had a wonderful time on 15 and 20. Went to places like Colorado, Papua New Guinea for the first time, a Papa II station, Montego Bay, Jamaica, British Columbia, Canada, Derbyshire in England, and both the Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland today, up in the spot where you and I were perched there making the video last week. So it's been a wonderful time for propagation, and this is any example of what it's going to be like in a year or two. Bring it on, man. Bring it on. Wonderful stuff. Back to you, Chris. VK3AML in the group, VK3ACZ.
Just before you move on, had your rope been disturbed?
No, it hadn't, but I've taken extra precautions now. It's now got 50-pound fishing line there, so it'll be harder to find. Back to you.
Ah, so you pull the rope up from the fishing line or something?
QSL.
Ah, okay. Much harder to see. Okay, good. Yeah, crafty. Not that anybody, even national parks people, could be bothered worrying about a piece of fishing line over a dead tree, which that tree is. If anything, that probably means that the tree is less conductive than most of the live trees, and therefore is a better support for your ham radio gear. It's interesting. You probably saw last week where Peter and I were up in South Belgrave, Dave, and we were getting all over the world, even with the moderately good propagation that was going on. I was talking strength 9 both ways on 100 watts to a station in North Italy who had flawless English. I gather from what he was saying, he was running 500 watts, so he must have a bit of dough, either that or be an electrical engineer who's built his own gear. And very impressed with the audio quality too. So that particular combination of battery and rig and antenna seems to do very well. But one thing that people have always said to me, Dave, I'm aiming this at mostly, is that if you make a flower pot antenna, you really have to have an antenna analyzer to work out whether you've got exactly the right choke on the end of your dipole, and whether the dipole has to be trimmed down in length because of the thickness of the wire or whatever. It needs measurement. VK3ECG and group VK3AML.
Yeah, VK3ECG, just leaving a pause. No, you're absolutely right. I mean, effectively, the the choke, and I suppose it just is a sort of con mode choke at the end of the day, defines the one half of the dipole, the part that's connected to the screen on the coax. So the location of the choke is also very important as well as the outer distance and so on. And presumably the feed line between the choke and the rig shouldn't matter too much, but obviously the design of the choke would be important to make sure it effectively operates as the end of the dipole. But I must say I found that the simple actual straight dipole seemed to be a bit better than the flower pot, I have to say. But to be fair, I'm comparing one Saturday afternoon with another Saturday afternoon, and of course conditions might have changed significantly. But the other weekend I was certainly really only running somewhere between 5 and 10 watts, and it varied a bit. And I worked probably half a dozen or so quite varied stations. And it took all around Europe, as I said, Finland and Spain and Netherlands and Belgium and so on, and the Italians, of course, are always running their kilowatt plus, or at least some of them are running their kilowatt plus stations, and certainly as the receive on the 705 was fantastic. I was certainly able to hear a great deal. It was just I'm obviously there were a lot of people from ZL and VK who were also running quite significant amount of power with beams and things like that. And there's me sitting on a hillside with a sort of battery in my pocket and a bit of wire up, and with between 5 and 10 watts. And I was still the other weekend working stations. I mean, my signals were, 4 or 5. Varying between about 4 and 5 strength as well. So I was well down, but not surprising. In many cases, I was working a station with 3-element Yagi or something like that, running a kilowatt, and there's a little bit of difference there. But I think as Peter VK3Y has clearly demonstrated in his recent videos, you can do a lot with low power. And even today, even though I was seemed to be being blasted by everyone as soon as someone called CQ, I was just being demolished immediately by people running a lot of power around me. And you just have to keep going, and eventually you get in when there's a gap. But I think often the big powerful stations are just listening for other big powerful stations. What I can't get over is that they always seem to give everyone a 5.9 report when it clearly isn't. It cannot be a 5.9 report. So I'm always a little bit astonished like that. But I think it's just become almost de rigueur and something to be sort of quietly forgotten. I remember I think you're right with the gain and so on. I think Peter did a review or a video on the bobtail curtain a little while ago, and that would seem to be quite an interesting antenna to try, especially if you've got a lot of space. I think there's one where he's sort of walking around and moving the pole and showing the reasonable directionality of it. And so that would be interesting thing to do as well. But I'll have to have a different setup for that sort of arrangement, but I might have a go sometime. I like the idea of leaving the rope. I'm just not sure where I go. I was sitting there today, and there was a mob of kangaroos about 50 metres away watching me very, very warily, and grazing all around. So I'm just a little bit unsure about leaving Great, not Great, I mean, they won't see it, I'm sure. But don't want to cause too much wildlife issues. But there we are. I must say, I really did enjoy the organ playing. Chris, that was really nice. The trumpet tune. There's a whole series of these sort of baroque trumpet voluntaries and trumpet tunes and so on. That's a fairly well-known one and lovely. A bit of Bach, some sort of Bach prelude. I know it, but I couldn't immediately jump to which one it was. And of course, it was nice on the BBC stuff, hearing the Dvorak Symphony from the New World, followed by the RCA stuff as well, which I thought was quite fitting, really, moving from the old world to the new world. But anyway, back to you, Chris. VK3AML in the group, VK3ECG.
VK3ECG, VK3AML. It's a pity that I could only show the first half of that BBC documentary, because quite frequently the second half, which actually shows the opening day's transmission from Alexandra Palace, is used by the BBC, and obviously the bots that do the copyright scanning have scanned that and have claimed I've got it off a BBC program. I haven't. I got it off the original film from 1936, which is already on YouTube in 2 or 3 different places. So I desisted and moved forward to the American stuff, and the Americans are very good when they put up stuff on Prelinger Archive, on the Internet Archive, or from their national archives on their National Archives YouTube. Invariably you can use it as much as you like. That's what it's there for. That's their attitude. The taxpayer has paid for this, therefore go ahead. And I've never had any trouble with the YouTube live streaming of that American material. If I was going from material from a private copyrighted source, or from a footage library that exists on selling that material, it might be different. But no, the BBC is all usage of anything related to the BBC is always a problem. It's sad, because if anything, we're closer to BBC history in this country because of our British Empire origins than we are to America. And America generally followed a different television history to Britain anyway. In Britain, mechanical television receivers were used right up to the war, including on high definition. The Scoffany Company had largest screen television receiver you could get in 1938, and it was entirely a mechanical scan system. Mirror polygons and an ultrasound Schlieren optics light modulator, the likes of which probably had never been used before in television and has never been used since. A very interesting system. But yeah, it looks like the BBC stuff is generally out of bounds. I can use German material, as you saw, and I can use American material, but not British. Damn it. Now, bobtailed curtain, interesting. The problem would be how to string it up. But any portable antenna for HF, if it's wire, it immediately becomes more portable. Like you can roll it up and put it into a shopping bag or something similar to take it home, as Peter demonstrated with the flower pot antenna. And Peter's flower pot, VK3CMC, had done a lot of work on getting the size of that right with a borrowed antenna analyzer, and they got it just right long before I went up on South Belgrave with Pete. And it showed. I mean, I was really amazed at the quality, the bandwidth, and the level of the signals from 20 metres, really surprising. If you had a horizontal antenna and you could hoist that up the trees somehow, I suppose a horizontal being all up at that level rather than a vertical which starts near the ground might have some height advantage. The other thing that Peter informed me was that the choke at the bottom end of the flower pot antenna has to be well clear of ground, otherwise you get earth proximity effects which throw out the whole electrical effect of the choke. Or at least I think that's what you said, Peter. VK3ACZ and group VK3AML.
Yeah, just left a little pause there. VK3AML and the group VK3ACZ. Yes, and funny thing about it too, the 20-metre antenna is a bit of a problem because of its length. There's one location I go to that doesn't have a tall tree. I rely on a 10-metre squid pole, and so it's effectively at 45 degrees, or probably probably more horizontal than that even. And I've had some wonderful signal reports, which brings me to what Dave said about 5 nines. Yes, I think some people feel that they're being polite by giving you 5 nines. I have my doubts sometimes when you have to tell them 6 times what your call sign is, and they say after it, you're a 5 by 7, 5 by 8 or 9 or something like that. Come on, really? And the classic example of that, or the one I have proof about, my very first Malta contact on Gozo Island, I was given, I think the comment was along the lines of, beautiful signal, 5 by 7 from me. And he put it on YouTube, and I could barely understand it myself, and I'd been the one talking. So, but you could even see the S meter, and I never really got above 3 or 4. So I don't know where his beautiful signal 5 by 7 came from. Again, it's probably just being polite. And something to tell you about propagation at the moment that I'm really noticing, Chris, is the amount of backscatter. Mornings on 10 metres are absolutely wonderful. I set up in a portable location, not the one at Belgrave because it's too far to go, and I'm hearing the stateside, and I'm hearing VK4s, 5s, 7s, and all that, and it's that hollow backscatter sound, but I virtually hear all of them. And even this afternoon I had a 10-metre contact with the VK6 between Meekatharra and Broome, and he was on the highway with the highway road noise, and it wouldn't be sporadic. I think most all this stuff would be F2 propagation, and it's just fantastic. I can't believe how good it is. This is from 10 and 15 metres. When I joined the hobby only 2 years ago, you could fire a cannon and nobody knew you were there. So it's all fantastic. Getting back to what you said before. The American material, that's a bit sad because we're exposed to so much of it, and I'm sure you'd agree that it doesn't hold the same wonder for me as the BBC material. It's just a pity that we can't have easy access to it. To me, it's almost counterintuitive. And one other thing to mention for this over, I had a really pleasant rag chew with an English expat in Echo Alpha, and it went for just under an hour. In fact, it was marvellous because nobody tried to interrupt or talk over the top of either of us, and the next station came in did so when I finally gave my 7.3s. But because he was English, ideally would like to ask what they're doing in Spain rather than being in England. And I'm just wondering if I could ask Dave's and your opinion. Is it polite to ask, or is it the sort of thing that you are best not broaching? Just a mild curiosity of mine. No, nothing intense about that there. Back to you, Chris. VK3AML in the group, VK3ACZ.
Yeah, that's enough time for leaving a pause to see if anybody would break. On one occasion, I received slow scan TV from a Spanish station, obviously English with the voice between the pictures. And I dropped him a line and said, how is it you come to be in Spain? And he said, tax burden of Britain, lousy weather, and you can buy some acreage here that you can't afford in England and stick up a decent antenna system. And I suppose that's fair enough. He also said that the local councils tend not to stick their nose in when you're putting up an antenna construction half so much as they do in Britain with building applications and engineering calculations and all the rest of it. They seem to be convinced that the councils seem to be convinced that they should oppose ham radio antennas at every possible opportunity, as some councils in Melbourne have. I believe Monash at one stage was very bad in that respect, and I think the WIA eventually took them to court, and they won because the Monash Council's attitude was that amateur radio, at least at reasonable powers, like say above 100 watts, was not a reasonable activity in a built-up area. That was their attitude. No technical people on the council, obviously. So in some ways it's good to have, in inverted commas, a union behind you when councils act in that way. Yarra Ranges Council can be that way. They're very green, and while generally I support forest preservation and sustainability, I know a lot of green friends that are green who go over the top with it to the extent of believing they should tell everybody how to live. And there are limits. Limits which actually impugn, if they step over them, impugn their own credibility. I think that sort of puts my case fairly. The Belize station that we spoke to, Peter, or at least that you spoke to, interestingly, from the K, Ralph Klimek, VK3ZZC, who works at the moment a lot of FT8 on 20 metres, tells me that that same Belize station is very active on FT8. He gets him constantly. So it would appear that our voice contact was a bit of an exception to the rule for him. As for the organ, Dave, I filmed that exactly as it happened. I was not even intending to film dear old Gordon at all. He had to nip into the church to pick up some material related to choral practice. I think some music that he was unfamiliar with to practice. And he just happened to see me showing an interest in the organ. And what followed was, as I videoed, an impromptu recital. He didn't have the right shoes for working the foot pedals. He was a bit embarrassed by that. But some of these ham radio operators particularly, I mean, Gordon was brilliant. He had a long career in broadcast engineering, somewhat like myself and Clint. He was interested in high-quality audio. He also had, how can I put this in polite terms, a bullshit bell that rang at a fairly low level. He wouldn't reveal that he knew that what the person was saying was BS, but he would reveal to you afterwards that guy didn't know what he was talking about. And then he'd give you the lowdown. But he'd do it subtly and quietly. He was, by nature, a quiet, conciliatory chap. And I will miss him dearly. He showed me all around Salt Lake City, ferried me in his own car to various places, as you saw. I must say I was treated like royalty from the period of my Salt Lake City venture in 2008, and I intend to get back. I was intending to get back to see Gordon again, but something called cancer intervened, very sadly, and he died this week. Clint's still there. So is another friend of mine called Mickey Applebaum, who jokingly says that Salt Lake City, it being a Mormon city, and they define anybody non-Mormon as being a Gentile, he has the punchline, it's the only place I can go in America where I can be a Jew and a Gentile at the same time. Sorry, I've used that line many times. VK3ECG and the group VK3AML.
Yeah, VK3AML and group VK3ECG. Yes, no, it was, fantastic to see someone just sort of sitting there and just and playing. I mean, obviously he would have a whole repertoire of work that he would regularly play at the end of services and so on. And he probably played for weddings and funerals and things like that, which is the way of the organist's life, I think. And yes, obviously accompanying choirs and so on. And most of the good musicians, they make sure they're up to having at least been through the music, if it's something they're not as familiar with, or refreshing their memories on it before they are playing live and in earnest. But it was a really interesting organ there, that combination of real pipes and the electronic as well, because it looked like the size of a chamber organ, but was clearly effectively full size, because it was a hybrid of electronic and pipes, and that was really very interesting, because clearly they could get the at least the sort of the 4 foots, and probably around the back some of the 8 foots, because you could fold them, and of course if you cap them, then they're basically an octave lower, but they have a very different sound. So it's really fascinating, and the switches and so on the fronts of the keyboards, as you would have seen, allow you to couple various parts of the keyboards with the pedals and vice versa, and obviously having fast sort of programmed bits and pieces for the different stops and so on. So it was quite. It was nice seeing that sort of interesting sort of hybrid organ. I mean, there's some wonderful instruments around, and every year in January in Victoria there's the festival Organs of the Goldfield, because a lot of the churches and things were built on the gold money in central Victoria. That they used to use the money and build quite a nice church, and they actually built quite a lot of organs. And so that a lot of the churches in central Victoria have quite reasonable organs because of the wealth. It was a bit like that in the UK with the wool industry. So if you go through Norfolk and Suffolk and so on, these tiny villages, which would have had no more than 50, 100 people, had a huge, magnificent church, often with, quite well and beautifully carved choir stalls and so on, and this is all basically the money made from basically sheep farming. Don't think of it as much in the UK, but a lot of these churches were built because of the profits, and also people were sort of, I suppose, using it a bit like a donation to do good, to guarantee themselves their place, in a bit like I've forgotten the word. In Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, the person who sells the I've forgotten the word. Anyway, a word now. The items to ensure you get into heaven. It'll come to me. But yes, I think the pardons, weren't there, or whatever. But yeah, fascinating. Yeah, UK's in Spain. I mean, my sister-in-law lives in Spain, and she and her husband have got a fair. I mean, it's a fairly ramshackle place, but on reasonable bit of land with almond trees, and they basically are almost self-sufficient, really. And they've been there quite a few years now. I've stayed with them on the odd occasion. But I mean, it used to be that because there was so much travel to Spain for holidays anyway. I mean, which Monty Python made a good joke out of as well. And lots of people had holiday places, a lot of timeshare type stuff in Spain as well. Was very popular at one stage. It used to be that a lot of the gangsters would go over to Spain and sort of slightly hide out. So you can always accuse them of being gangsters, I suppose. But no, it is fairly common, and there are quite interesting financial differences and structural banking, and as you said, local law differences. I spent some time there once with some forensic colleagues and lawyer colleagues, and they were absolutely fascinating in terms of the way in which their system works. They have these sort of interesting roles where it's more than a solicitor. It's halfway between a solicitor and a judge, and so if they make a decision, that is a binding decision on contracts and so on. It's really a very interesting sort of like a notary public type approach. Which is very European and continental, and we don't really have it in the same way in Australia or the UK. So yeah, it's a different world. and but they have some very strange things as well about taxation and so on. So that was the other reason for going, was that there's a great deal of advantage on a tax front. I think that someone was telling me that you sort of got taxed on what was in your bank account once a year. So of course the day before the relevant date, everyone would go to the bank and take all their money out in suitcases and take it home, and then the day after the tax day, they put it all back in the bank again, so that they had very little in the bank to be taxed on at the relevant time. It sounds like it was an armed robber's delight, I would have thought, but anyway, so be it. I'm commenting on what you were saying about the human rights stuff. I mean, yes, politics, human rights, they're interwoven, but they're not the same. And I've been looking at, and I haven't spoken to anyone specifically, but there's a number of my colleagues now starting to get involved in some identification work and so on in Ukraine, and I think that will pick up. It will probably depend on how soon the actual hostilities stop. But there's going to be, I suspect, years and years of work and an awful lot of publicity and publication eventually on what happened and what's found. I got quoted in the Age, I think, last week with one of my colleagues when we were reviewing some of the video footage that the Russians had said demonstrated these people were actors and not dead, and my colleague and I looked at it all and made an opposite comment, which got published. But what will happen out of that, I don't know. It's a complicated and difficult sort of thing that I suspect will not has a long way to go. Let's put it like that. Back to you, Chris. VK3AML in the group, VK3ECG.
VK3CG and group VK3AML returning. Well, yes, Ukraine is a complex issue, almost as complex and as harrowing as Israel and Palestine. You've got the east of Ukraine, which is predominantly ethnically Russian, and the west of Ukraine, where it's predominantly ethnically Ukrainian, with the Ukrainian language and customs, and the Russians seem to be pushing the invasion of the east of the Ukraine, which, with a lot of their activity, wouldn't make a huge deal of difference to the country. But they have been attacking the capital and attacking the west of Ukraine, including people trying to escape, and that comes under the heading of war crime from my point of view. That's as far as I'll take my comments, except to say that I sympathise with Russian hams, but I think we shouldn't be talking to them on the air at the moment, not because I hate Russian hams, but because I feel for their security. You can be sure in a totalitarian state that anybody who has equipment that can talk internationally will at least be under the surveillance of the officials of that totalitarian state. So if the Russian hams start talking to us, they may be endangering the security of themselves or their family or their associates. So for the moment, I think discretion is the better part of valour, and we should back off. Personal opinion only, and I don't intend to apply that rule to anybody, but I have seen people putting up YouTube clips saying that, ham radio should be completely non-political, and we should talk and befriend the Russians. And I'm thinking, has this guy thought it through? Does he realise the security issues incumbent on communication systems in a totalitarian state which is at war, whether they like it or not? Okay, so much for that. So Peter, yes, the Belize station that we spoke to apparently is active in other fields, and Ralph, VK3ZZC, has communicated with him. And I wonder if you've thought of other forms of antenna to try, like a dipole, up quite apart from the sloper that you've tried, a horizontal dipole, perhaps even one at an angle, tied to that same tree branch, operating with some light vertically dropped coax. VK3ACZ in group, VK3AML.
Yeah, VK3AML in the group, VK3ACZ. Well, I do have a dipole with a nice 1-to-1 in the middle of it, fed by coax. I've also got a, I don't know if you call it, I can't remember if you call it a ZEP or whatever it is, but the ladder line feeder with the 4-to-1. And I just find that the flower pot is fulfilling all requirements at this stage, especially as it's only got one mounting point as opposed to needing two. Well, I suppose if I run my ladder line antenna as an inverted V, it probably only needs 1 point realistically. But no, it's I'm very happy with and something I forgot to say in the previous over is that those coax half waves, and I'm starting to get sick of the term flower pot because it does sound demeaning, are amazing the way the SWR is so flat right across the band. Oh, of course, 15 metres is a bit of a wide, well, 10 and 15 are fairly wide, come to think of it. But surprised how well they just don't need a tuner, which is wonderful because I can put my FT818 in situ or the 891 and don't need to worry about a tuner. Wonderful things. As I think I said last week, the only problem is I'm so used to having an end fed where I just push the button to change bands. Now I've got to put up a separate antenna for each one, but not to worry. Just last word about English expats living overseas. No reference directly to you. I'm thinking of closer to England. I mean, I quite understand people coming out to this side of town. It could be anything from better weather to, well, you name it. I've been to England, so I've got a rough idea why you'd probably not necessarily think it's the best place to be at times. It's certainly awfully beautiful, please don't get me wrong, I'm not being derogatory, but I noticed that F6, I think it's ARC, I'm not too sure, Oliver in Chartres, France, he's the only F station that I've heard that's got an English accent, and purely anecdotal, but I must have spoken to at least 20 Echo Alphas with English or Scottish accents, and of course the most famous one with the thickest Glasgow drogue is EA5JZ Paul from Glasgow. He's and he's always got a cracking signal. I don't know how he does it. He's 20 over 9 when the long path to Europe is completely closed. I don't know how he. But anyway, one last comment too, Chris, you might be interested in this. Your Flinders Island, now when was that, August last year or something like that? Sandra was at her bushwalking group meeting in Ringwood on Thursday, and a lady was doing a presentation on walks that were done on Flinders Island. And she mentioned your broadcast, and one thing led to another, and the next thing she was given the link to your Flinders Island broadcast, and I would imagine she'd find it very, very entertaining. So just another way of saying that your broadcasts are still popular even from months ago. Hi. VK3AML in the group, VK3ACZ.
Well, that Flinders Island trip was quite a few years ago now. Either January or February of 2018, I went over there with VK3 ASE, Dave, and we spent 9 days on the island. We ran up 1,100 kilometres on the higher ute. We got to the island and Dave immediately said, get a ute, not a car, because they can go on tracks that cars never can. They have much better ground clearance and we can carry stuff in the back, and there's only the two of us anyway. And he was dead right, so we hired it. Cost us each about $400, I think, for the hire for the week, a bit more than that, and for the 9 days. But we got around all sorts of places on the island. on the east coast, which is wild. It's a long strip of sand, almost 70 kilometres long, whereas the west coast has lots of little islands off the shore. Fascinating. It is a fascinating place, and it's the third largest offshore island around Australia. Groot Island in Gulf of Carpentaria is the largest. Kangaroo Island is the second largest, and Flinders Island off the northeast tip of Tasmania is the third largest, if you don't call Tasmania an offshore island. But I can recommend it as a place for anybody to go. But yeah, the video was made at least 4 years ago, and I've been meaning to go back there and shoot some more. Dave also took a lot of video over there. To me, the two most interesting things we did was walking up the Strzelecki Peaks, the highest part of the island, because the view from up there, nearly 3,000 feet up, straight up from the sea, is one of the most spectacular mountain views I've seen anywhere in Australia, with literally hundreds of islands in sight on a good day. And we had a perfect day. No clouds, no wind, 20 degrees C, just wonderful. You can go up there and get clouded in so easily. And the other point of major interest for me was seeing the most intact pre-World War I radio station surviving anywhere in Australia, in Australasia for that matter. It was decommissioned in 1941, turned into storage rooms for the local farm, very rarely touched, and still had all the wires in place in the walls. Only the equipment had been pulled out of it, but the building itself was part of the equipment of the spark transmitter. So it was like Dave and me walking into the radio engineering equivalent of Tutankhamun's tomb. So much surviving from those days of spark, big antennas and Oregon masts 180 feet high. Yeah, great place. And well worth visiting, Dave, if you haven't been there. It costs a bit to get there by plane from Essendon. I think it was $500 return. But once you're there, there's a lot to see. And a very good pub, which you can stay at Whitemark, or a motel-style accommodation at Lady Barron on the south end of the island. I prefer Whitemark personally, because I lived close to Whitemark when I lived there in 1977, so it has a long association, and so do some of the people there. Yeah, and Dave, with regard to the organ that the late K7HFV Gordon Smith was playing, the Americans seem to have this not as much conservatism about musical instrument design as other countries, hence the development of the banjo in the 19th century, or some of the extraordinary theatre organs, Wurlitzer, Compton. I think Compton's American, I'm not sure about that, might be British, but they're less hidebound by tradition than the English, so that idea of combining an electronic organ with bass response at the low end with a pipe organ for all of the treble seems to work extremely well. And at one point there, Gordon was demonstrating that you could shift the absolute frequency of all of the notes in the electronic organ exactly by pushing one of the keys on the pipe organ and then getting a beat note from the same key on the electronic equivalent. Brilliant. I'd never seen anything like that before, I must admit, but then my experience of church organs is not great. And effectively it was a small church because it's church in the round. The pulpit was in the middle, and rather like the Congregational Church in Melbourne City, so that nobody's very far from the preacher and everybody's close together in terms of being close to the organ and the choir. VK3ECG and group VK3AML.
Yeah, VK3AML and the group VK3ECG. Yes, it is amazing. I don't know if you've seen many of the small chamber organs, which are really very small and don't have much of the larger ranks of pipes, so that they really only have the 4 foots or whatever, and they are amazing. Really, all sort of a box that maybe I don't know, sort of almost more like a upright piano, a small upright piano at that. But they are, I mean, they haven't got large volumes of sound, but as an accompanying instrument for sort of earlier music and small orchestras and so on, they're amazing, and the tone is just beautiful, and some of them. So it really is interesting. I put up a thing on the chat because Bob Heil, of course, is another organ player, and I put up the link to his unfortunate appearance as Santa playing his Christmas medley. But I think he at some stage, I remember on, I think it must have been that Ham Nation YouTube thing that he had, I suppose he still has, I don't know, I haven't looked at it for a long time. He sort of moved house and moved the entire thing. I'm not sure. I think that was mostly electronic, but I don't know. Certainly some of the amazing grand organs in the Macy's, in the US, which is one of the largest of the organs, and the ranks of stops are just unbelievable on these things, and the mixing and the matching, and it's extraordinary what they can do with some of those larger instruments. However, some of the small instruments in the small churches and so on are absolutely beautiful. Particularly some of the Central European churches, where a lot of these things, of course, were all mechanical. There was a small boy at the back with the bellows pumping it up and down to keep the organ with the pressure in, because it's an extremely low pressure system. It's about volume, effectively, rather than pressure. And so most, of course, they're all electronic big fans, and it's basically blowing into a large box or a series of boxes, and the pipes are inserted into those boxes, and then valve flaps move and you press the keys, and that allows the low pressure but high volume air to go through the pipe. And they're incredible, all mechanical couplings. I mean, they would have been the whole thing was mechanical. And some of those early organs have been beautifully rebuilt and sound incredible today. And then you have the square wooden pipes, have a totally different sound. You have the trumpet type pipes, which often have a reed in them as well to make a buzzy, reedy sound. So there's just lots and lots of different variations, and again, how you they tune in a variety of ways, and there's a real art to both design and the layout of the organ, because you can walk between the ranks of pipes in the big ones in the organ loft, and it's extraordinary, having walked around a few of them in my time. What with all my sort of church type singing I used to do. So but absolutely fascinating stuff. It really is. I think I might have a go at trying one of those bobtail curtain things. I think that could be quite interesting. Getting a bit of gain and a bit of directionality could be quite nice. And where I go up in the Warrandyte State Park, I've got a fairly open area with 3 or 4 trees in it which are usable. Although I tried throwing a line in today and I discovered that the weight on my line was a little bit too heavy. I simply couldn't chuck it high enough. And then I should have been wearing gloves, because I gave myself a blister as the line ran through my fingers, which was not a good thing to do either. But it would be quite fun to do that, and even if you just put up a couple of squid poles or something like that, just to they don't have to be very, very high, I don't think, for the bobtail. Certainly not on 20. Be interesting to see what else you could do. I'll have a think, and I'll get out Peter's design things and have a look at them and see what I can come up with. Back to you, Chris. VK3AML and Group VK3ECG.
VK3CG and Group VK3AML. Yeah, I remember years ago having a chat with my predecessor with my call sign, Tony Sanderson, VK3AML, and he was saying something about when you have a curtain array of antennas, such as a Sturber curtain or a Franklin antenna, as were commonly used for shortwave international broadcasters who had a lot of acreage and a lot of poles up, an array just consisting of dipoles suitably phased and reflectors, once you are beyond a certain length of array, that instead of transmitting waves that were spreading out in all directions as it would with a vertical dipole, you were getting directionality because the wave fronts coming out of the system would start to be plane parallel rather than diverging or something like that, and that gave you a gain factor over and above the summing of the output of the various dipoles. Don't know whether I described that clearly, but there was something to do with the shape of the emitted waves, the wave shape in space, that a large array, which was a significant proportion of a wavelength or larger, would give you when it was an array, a curtain array of antennas. It's covered by a book here I have somewhere too, come to think of it, by an early engineer of shortwave antennas named C.S. Franklin, and I believe he was the same chap from which the Franklin oscillator got its name, which used to be used as a VFO by Tony, the late 3AML, many years ago. Very stable oscillator as long as you had your coils wound of the appropriate wire to give a positive frequency change with temperature, and the tuning capacitors across them, NPO ceramics I think they were called, which had a negative coefficient to cancel out frequency changes with changes of temperature. Of course, nowadays they do it with crystals and synthesis, so it's a whole new ball game and much more stable. But in the old days with VFOs, that was probably the way to go. Looking down the list here, not much else to cover, except, Dave, my experience in Tasmania, where, unlike the rest of Australia, there's a lot of churches that were built in the first half of the 19th century. And I've seen organs that date back to the 1820s and 30s down there, and obviously the people that used them in some cases must have been musically illiterate, because they, not all that often, but you strike them, have a barrel attachment which could, by sliding the barrel axially against the pins that would activate the keys on the organ, you could get a selection of about 20 different hymns that you could literally crank out by cranking the barrel while somebody was pushing the bellows on the thing. That goes back to the end of the 18th century, the 1700s, I think. Round to Peter. By the way, it was lovely to be able to have a chat with your wife at that Belgrave South thing. Pity I didn't get more of her on video, but it was her choice. But great to meet her. Very nice person. She created a good impression, Peter, and I hope she hears it. VK3ACZ and Group VK3AML.
Yeah, VK3AML and the Group VK3ACZ. Well, she's not hearing it right now, but I will convey your sentiments to her, and thanks very much for that. It's appreciated. Going back a bit, you mentioned the Belize station on FT8. Well, never let it be said that I've joined the dark side. Hi. I like the way John 3EGG says digital means doesn't work. But no, I've got no great aversion to it. I just don't have the desire for me, the fun aspect of amateur radio is shooting the voice across the ionosphere. However, that manages to work. But I've got to say one thing, Chris, at the moment, and again, we're still some distance from the top of the cycle. But every morning this week, ZLs have been 30 over 9 on 10 metres. The States, sometimes nearly as strong, but of course you can always say, well, some of them are running 1.5K, so big deal about that. And of course the ZLs are running a kilowatt too, come to think of it. But even the 20-watt beacon down in Christchurch is coming across strength 9 sometimes. I get the feeling, and I say that slightly tongue-in-cheek, that you could just about work ZL at the moment on 10 with a non-resonant length of wet string, high. But anyway, just a quick word about the curtain antenna and Peter's idea. Love the guy. Absolutely think he's fantastic for amateur radio, and what he does is nothing short of amazing. I can only hope that there'll be a QRP by the bay again soon, so I can, sit with him and put the stomach pump on him, and because what he doesn't know about QRP, what he doesn't, and I've got his books, of course, what he doesn't know about amateur radio in a lot of senses wouldn't be worth knowing. And Dave, the only thing, if you're going to emulate him at all with your curtain array, you need to have it beside salt water. You've got to have shorts and bare feet, and you've got to have sand all over your rig. And I mean that in the nicest, smiling sort of a way. Back to you, Chris, VK3AML, VK3ACZ.
Yes, and hello to Dennis VK1DKO on the stream. And I think Terry Stims is there. John Young. Somebody who calls himself Pirate, although he evinces a knowledge of radio communication which I suspect is well beyond a pirate's knowledge. And Mick. And an American, Harb's Electronics Lab, I think, is an American ham, and it would be very early morning, I think, over most of America. So nice to see you all on the net. We've had on the stream 59 individual views so far, and at the moment, though, 13 concurrent viewers. So the Australian numbers tend to drop off after midnight, as you might imagine. At its peak, we had 19 concurrent viewers. Yeah, just looking through the comments there. So it'll be interesting to see how this one goes. This particular selection of television material goes in the longer term. Last week's got quite a few hits after we signed off, but obviously that when I go out with a camera and shoot stuff live that's original, the number of hits goes up quite markedly. So I'll have to pull the digit out and get down to Ralph VK3ZZC and do an interview with him, as he's offered to let me do so. Ralph has a long background in quite complex analytical equipment and knows a lot about the theory which he can apply. He's just a few weeks retired, so it'll be interesting to see what he does with amateur radio now that he has the time to pursue it. Bob Heil, I'm very much a fan of his. He speaks a lot of sense, particularly about acoustics. Having the background in music makes it one step even better. I agree with him about audio quality on ham radio, and he points out that it can be a lot better than it is in many cases. I think when originally the first stations went to sideband in the early 70s, the audio quality on average of ham radio went to the pack. It had been reasonably good on AM. Most people running AM were aiming at getting the best possible audio quality. Didn't happen when you went to 300 Hz to 3K sideband. That's when, in the early 1970s, suddenly the emphasis was on cutting through the noise. to the point where people sounded so tinny that they all sounded the same, which they do also on high compression digital audio codecs. Terrible, some of them. D-Star I really won't have a bar of. I think it's over to Dave. Can't think of anything else. The IC705, was that the rig that you brought to the Columbia Park exercise that I got a bit of video of, Dave? And it looks like a remote head, but it's actually the whole rig. Is that the one? VK3ECG in the group, VK3AML.
Yeah, VK3ECG. Yes, that's the one. Yeah, I suppose yes, it does look a bit like a remote head, but it's very similar in sort of superficial looks to the 7300 that you've got, Peter. But I think a lot of the menu systems are a little bit similar. I've not used the 7300s though, so I'm not necessarily the right person to ask about that. It uses the same battery as the ICOM ID51 or the new ID52. I think I haven't seen one of those though. Handheld. So it's basically the same as the handheld 2 meter 7 centimeter handheld battery that clips onto the back of it. So in that sense, it's got a battery. With that battery that clips on the back, you only get 5 watts. So I've got that little sports model type battery, which is a lithium iron phosphate battery, which I got some time ago, and rewired. That was a bit of a scary task, rewiring a battery, those sort of things, with and some power poles, so that I can basically use it on anything. I mean, the current delivery from these lithiums is incredible. Not that the 705 takes that much. I'd be very interested to see what happens if you try and take a lot more amperage from it. Obviously, it wouldn't last as long, but I suspect that, like a lot of the lithium cells, it would actually deliver quite a high current if it required to, and therefore on sideband and something like that, it might actually be feasible even for a short time to use something like that. I probably wouldn't, but it does make you think there's a possibility. It's got no antenna tuner in it, and that's why I want to try and stick to resonant antennas as far as possible. Obviously, it can use a small matching unit, but there's no reason why I shouldn't be using resonant antennas anyway. So for the most part, so that's what I've been doing. The other sort of antenna I'm sort of thinking about was whether you can do anything for sort of like a Moxon or something like that, which again has some reasonable front-back gain, and although there's not much direction, well, it's directionality sort of across 180 degrees, but it would certainly be interesting to see if you could, poke it in the right direction. This time, this weekend, I was just using and I take Peter's point, not that the flower point antenna side of it was really designed for when they were running them on 2 meters and 70 centimeters and sticking them in flower pots literally, but otherwise it's just the in-pit dipole arrangement, and I was probably just running out as a sloper, and it wasn't that vertical, unfortunately, and if I could get it high enough into a tree, it would have been a lot easier, but the dipole, which I put up, was actually, didn't really take that much less time to put up the dipole, in fact, and that seemed to work extremely well. Certainly able to have quite nice chats to one guy in the UK for quite some time in Cambridge, and and again, I was probably only he was I think an older ham, older than me, and he gave me, I think, a truthful report of sort of 5.3, 5.4, which is probably pretty good for what I was trying to do. But again, fully copyable, and that's all you need. You don't need to have a big, powerful signal if you can communicate, and that worked extremely well. Yeah, I think that's probably all I've got here at the moment. I might call it an evening. Got a few little things to do tomorrow, and might try and get myself to bed and get some sleep. So back to you, Chris. VK3AML and the group VK3ECG.
VK3ECG and group VK3AML, and I was leaving a gap there for anybody who might like to break in. And I've got my bass response up too high. I can hear occasional mic popping coming through my headphones. Unusual with a dynamic mic. AKG dynamic. Okay, I haven't got much more either, except that comment on barrel organs, early 19th century in Tasmania. Tasmania seems to be a place where it being settled earlier than any other part of Australia, apart from Sydney, has some interesting survival from the period of early Victorian era, and even from William IV's era, which can be fascinating, usually fairly primitive and usually very basic, and not often with 88 notes. It's usually 55 notes or less, I think, on quite a few of the keyboards I've seen over there. From memory, some of the keyboards of that period reverse the small keys are white and the large keys are black. I don't quite know why. I think that was the case with harpsichords as well, but I seem to remember seeing that on organs in Tasmania. Anyway, round to Peter perhaps for a final two, and we'll wrap it up. I must come out again with you, Peter, to do a bit more videoing of some of the DX that you're chasing, and put more of an effort into actually patching the audio from your rig across to the video camera. VK3ACZ and group VK3AML.
Yeah, VK3AML in the diminishing group, VK3ACZ. Yes, I'm happy to tie the ribbon now. It's getting a bit late, and be good for us all to go QRT, I would think. So glad that Prue's back home and all seems to be okay there, moon boot notwithstanding. And, well, you'd be welcome, Chris. The logistics aren't too difficult at all, as you know. And today would have been a cracking day too, because there wasn't that embarrassing pile-up to get to the Belize station. We had some great contributors in the DX side of things. We had Italians, English, Canadian, a few US stations, and all very, very strong signals too. Oh man, it's been good lately. It's been really good. I know I probably said it just earlier tonight, but I really joined the hobby at the right time, to experience it at the low point and watch the improvement. Much better than the other way around, and much better than seeing it go downhill. But anyway, now that'll be good, Chris. Just name the time. Although I hope to, hopefully you'll film from the behind me this time, so that I don't shock any of your viewers. Hi. And definitely try not to squint. I think the problem I had that day was I had dry eyes, and it was really playing merry havoc with me. But it wasn't until I saw myself doing it that I realised wasn't a good look for television or YouTube, shall we say. But anyway, another great another great test transmission that I will endeavour to catch up on probably first thing in the morning, and because thoroughly interested in the subject material, television. And every time you mention Logie Baird now, my ears prick up. It's good stuff, which you're contributing to the general knowledge of quite a few of us, and it's all really good. Anyway, thanks to Dave for your company tonight, and look forward to doing it all again next week. Cheers and 7-3 to you and the shortwave listeners. VK3AML, VK3ACZ. Good night, all.
Yeah, good night, fellas. Thanks for the QSO. As far as John Logie Baird goes, his son has been in touch with me. He's now in his late 80s. His grandson, Ian Baird, works at the Museum of the Moving Image, I think, in England, and has done a lot of research work on his grandfather's transmissions and equipment, and has located a lot of the surviving components, which I must do a little video on, where the stuff all ended up. Okay, I'll take a brief listen before closing, see if anybody else is about. If not, I'll close myself. VK3AML just standing by for any final call-ins on 147 475. No takers. Okay. I'll now close on 147 475. We'll be back on 9:30 p.m. next Saturday. Same bat time, same bat channel. VK3AML on 147 475. Wishing everybody a very good night.
Yeah, good night, Chris.
And to the people on the stream, thank you for being there. Always appreciated. Dennis particularly, and Chris Baird, if you're watching, please don't be so hard on us. I do this purely as an entertainment, well, not entertainment, I aim at sort of the documentary crowd, people that need a source of information, and the information might be on technology, it might also be on human rights or on renewables, and if you consider that to be political, well, your definition of politics does not accord with mine. And with that, hoping that hasn't created any enemies or ill feeling, I'll say a very good night to the live stream people. And if anybody's watching from Utah who, like myself, was a friend of Gordon, I was privileged to be able to call him friend, although most of our friendship was conducted via radio. Only that period when I was in Salt Lake City for a few weeks in 2008 did I get about with him face to face, which is to my eternal regret that I didn't get back in time to make a second trip. I hope to redress that if Brett or Clint KA7OEI are watching. I hope to get back to see you really soon, and I know it must be hard on you with Gordon gone, him being such an integral part of the Utah Amateur Radio Club and ham radio in general. We need more Gordon Smiths in this. We need more people with humility and knowledge and the willingness to pass that knowledge on. And with that, I'll say a very good night to the people on the stream. Thanks to Mick, thanks to VK1DO and all of you. And we'll see you next week, hopefully. As my father-in-law, who was in his 90s, said, God willing. I might be popping off the mortal coil, who knows. So all the